President Saleh remains the president of Yemen. He has, in fact, opened up a dialogue with his opposition. There's some fairly public negotiating going on, but this is exactly the kind of give and take that we believe is necessary.
Well, Steve Clements joins us now. He's a foreign policy analyst for the U.S. liberal think tank, the New America Foundation. The administration must realize how this looks and how it opens them up to charges of hypocrisy and double standards.
Well, when I was in the White House recently, a senior official said that they saw this as one of the most important opportunities to realign American interests and American values than we've had in generations. But it's much harder to actually deploy that. And when you step back and look at how what we've said at different points during these revolutions, it's clearly different. I do think the administration is trying to set up a very low bar cookie cutter that says no violence, respect the people in the street and their right to protest, and these governments better get reform moving.
But
there's not much we can do
for example, and yet the U.S. is now still full square behind the
Well, Bahrain had a split, essentially a split government where the army was listening to one part of the regime and we were talking to another part, but now we're trying to counsel these governments to move as quickly as possible to engage their publics and sort of coach them, if you will, on models that might work. But it may not work. It could still explode. And the U.S. government can't save these governments. I mean, these are governments that have been aging. They're monarchies. They're totalitarian in many cases. And there aren't clear succession plans in many of them. And to some degree, what the administration is saying, despite wanting to stand by interests that we have in the region, that fundamentally, if the social contract between the governed and the governments completely collapse, there's nothing we can do to save these governments.
And that's what many of the Bahrain opposition protesters tell our journalists that they feel has happened. The social contract is over. This is not time for regime alteration. It's time for regime change.
Right, and that is the tension. And I think the administration is going to pick and choose, depending what it sees as the prospects. I mean, in Egypt, to be quite clear, we weren't on the side of regime change. We were on the side of regime adjustment until it became very clear that didn't work. We were wanting to see Soleiman and the military and others succeed and move down that track, but it was just too late. So I think that there are gradations, but it's very clear that we're more comfortable with regime adjustment if you can get it. But if the tipping point is hit and the public, makes its move and looks as if it's going to win, I think that you'll see the winds blow.
Even for Saudi Arabia, even for Yemen, indeed. But in Saudi Arabia already, there are reports that they've banned protests, which is part of that low cookie cutter.
Right.
The red lines.
I think that creates a lot of discomfort for the United States. I think the Saudi situation and the Yemen situation are, for their own reasons, very complicated for us. Because if you really open up in Yemen, you have the failing of already a tripping regime. That is the place where there are more Osama bin Laden lookalikes trying to rise and to create, I think, a lot of pressure on the West and the United States. That creates a very unique set of problems. Saudi Arabia is an entirely different situation where it basically is such a home base for Islam in the world, and we have such equities in terms of what the Saudis have done, not only in the bilateral relationship, but the Saudis basically pave our way all around the world. If we want to go, pressure the Pakistanis, we do that through the Saudi oil.
Right, so basically the Obama doctrine then is the democratic will of the people is not always acceptable. Shouldn't we be looking at it that way, rather than that we support democracy if the regime fails?
I think we support certain principles, which means no violence, the right of the people to assemble and protest, which is what the Saudis are not allowing, and then third, trying to encourage reforms, which I would think the administration is trying to move the Saudis on that track.
Steve Clements, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have more later in this news hour from the Americas, including
the freedom of speech, freedom of information, and the freedom of expression taken to a logical extreme.
How these mysterious cyber hackers are influencing events half a world away.
And I'm Imran Khan. On the web desk, we'll have all the latest from cyberspace, including pictures from inside Egypt's ransacked security offices.
And as battle lines are drawn across the country, there's concern food supplies are under threat. Saudi Arabia has banned all demonstrations after a series of minor protests in the oil-producing eastern province. Al Jazeera could not authenticate this video that we have, which was posted online on Saturday. It shows hundreds of protesters rallying in the eastern town of Qatif on Thursday and Friday. They've been demanding the release of all prisoners being held without trial, as well as better access to jobs. They also want less powers for the ruling Al Saud family. The protests are continuing in Bahrain. Thousands marched again to Pearl Roundabout and formed a human chain around the capital, Manama. There have been daily protests in Bahrain for the past 2 weeks, with people calling for an end to what they say is discrimination and political persecution. Oman's Sultan Qaboos has replaced 2 of his cabinet ministers after days of violent unrest. Protesters have been calling for more jobs and better political representation. Meanwhile, workers have been staging a sit-in at the main oil field in Haima to demand more investment from the state. Hundreds of protesters have rallied in the Algerian capital. Police were on standby as the crowd moved towards Martyrs Square in Algiers. Opposition parties say Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government has squandered the country's wealth. The government recently lifted a 19-year-old state of emergency and allowed opposition voices on television. Now, more than 3 weeks have passed since the Egyptian uprising that ousted Hosni Mubarak, but the protests and the fallout go on. The former Interior Minister has pleaded not guilty to charges of money laundering and profiteering. But some claim Habib El Adli is facing the wrong charges. Shireen Tedros in Cairo explains.
First came the ousting, and now comes the justice. Habib El Adli, Egypt's former interior minister, mobbed by demonstrators shouting, "Execute him," as he was leaving court. El Adli is on trial for money laundering and profiteering. But people here want to see him tried for ordering the police to open fire on protesters during the revolution. And that's not all. This man says El Adli is responsible for setting prisoners free and deliberately causing chaos during the protests. This woman tells us it's not just El Adli, but all corrupt Interior Ministry officials who have policed with an iron fist that should stand trial.
For over 10 years, Habib El Adli was the face of one of the most hated institutions here, the Interior Ministry, as well as the security apparatus that came under its command. People are still asking for that security apparatus to be dismantled.
Outside state security headquarters in Cairo, that's exactly what was happening. Protesters demanding police forces leave the streets and a complete restructure of the security services. They claim now officials are going on trial. Police officers are burning and shredding any documents which could incriminate them and their bosses in the future.
They're burning all the papers behind this wall, and that's why some of us went inside and took the papers that they haven't completely burnt yet. And we're showing this evidence to the army.
Similar scenes were witnessed in the port city of Alexandria late Friday as police clashed with demonstrators outside a security building, injuring several people. Again, burnt identity cards were found by witnesses. As Egypt enters into a new era, people still want justice for the past. They see it as the only way to guarantee a different, better future. Shireen Tedros, AlJazeera, Cairo.
Now, earlier, protesters in Cairo stormed the state security building there. Let's talk to Hossam El Hamalwi, an Egyptian activist, blogger and journalist who was inside that building. Could you give us an idea of what took place inside that building?
Since late afternoon, protesters started assembling in front of the state security